As the royal guards approached Mr. Akin's farm, they found him tending to his corn crop under the scorching sun. Wiping sweat from his brow, Mr. Akin turned to face the approaching men, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Good day, gentlemen," Mr. Akin called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "What brings you to my humble farm?" The lead guard, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Mr. Akin, King Oba has summoned you to the palace immediately." Mr. Akin's heart sank, but he nodded slowly. "I see. May I ask what this is about?" "That's not for us to say," the guard replied curtly. "Will you come willingly?" Mr. Akin glanced at his unfinished work, then back at the guards. "Of course. Let me just put away my tools." As Mr. Akin gathered his things, another guard spoke up. "Wait, didn't the king say to bring the whole family?" The lead guard's eyes narrowed. "Indeed. Mr. Akin, where is your wife and daughter?" A chill ran down Mr. Akin's spine. He couldn't bear the thought of his family facing the king's wrath. They're not here," he stammered. "They went to the shop." The guards exchanged skeptical glances. "Check the house," the leader ordered one of his men. As they waited, Mr. Akin's mind raced. What could the king want? Deep down, he knew this had to be about his visit to the Agbio community. But how had the king found out? And why was he so angry? The guard returned, shaking his head. "The house is empty, sir." The lead guard sighed. "Very well. Mr. Akin, you'll have to come with us alone. But make no mistake, if the king wants to see your family, we will return for them." As they began the journey to the palace, Mr. Akin's worried thoughts consumed him. He silently thanked the gods that Mama Kiki and Kiki weren't home. At least they were safe for now. "What have I done?" he muttered to himself. One of the younger guards overheard him. "Did you say something, sir?" Mr. Akin shook his head. "No, nothing, just thinking aloud." The guard nodded sympathetically. "Try not to worry too much. The king is fair, most of the time." This did little to ease Mr. Akin's fears. As they walked, he couldn't help but think of Mike and his family. Had his well-intentioned visit caused trouble for them too? As they go on, Mr. Akin's anxiety peaked. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. "May I ask one thing?" Mr. Akin said to the lead guard. The guard raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" If something happens to me," Mr. Akin said softly, "please make sure my family is taken care of." The guard's stern expression softened slightly. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Akin. The king wishes to speak with you, that's all we know." As they continued on their way, Mr. Akin couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. He thought of Kiki, of her love for Mike, and of his own desire to see her happy. Whatever the consequences, he knew in his heart that he had done the right thing. With a deep breath, Mr. Akin straightened his back and lifted his chin. Whatever King Oba had in store for him, he would face it with dignity. As the sun began to set on the second day since Mr. James's sudden arrest, tension and worry filled the small hut where Mike and Mama Ada resided. The air was thick with anxiety, and the sound of Mama Ada's restless pacing echoed through the room. Mike sat on a low stool, his unseeing eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Mama," he said, breaking the tense silence, "it's been a full day now. We can't just keep waiting like this. We need to do something." Mama Ada paused her pacing, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I know, my son, but what can we do?" The guards were very clear. Mike stood up abruptly, his face set with determination. "I think it's high time we go to the palace ourselves. We need to find out what's happening to Papa. This silence is unbearable." Mama Ada's breath caught in her throat. "But Mike, remember what the guard said. Going to the palace might only make things worse for your father. We can't risk that." "And what if something terrible has already happened?" Mike countered, his voice rising with emotion. "For all we know, Papa could be he couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence." "Don't say such things," Mama Ada cried out, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. "We must have faith that your father is all right." Mike's shoulders slumped, the weight of their helplessness bearing down on him. "I'm sorry, Mama. I didn't mean to upset you. It's just, I feel so powerless." Mama Ada moved to her son, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I understand, my dear. I feel the same way. But we must think carefully about our next move." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Suddenly, Mama Ada's eyes lit up with an idea. "I think I know what we can do," she said, her voice tinged with hope. "Why don't we go to Elder Chidi? He's respected in the community and might be able to help us find out what's happening without risking your father's safety." Mike's face brightened at the suggestion. "That's a great idea, Mama. Elder Chidi has always been kind to us, and he's wise. If anyone can help us navigate this situation, it's him." Mama Ada nodded, relief evident in her voice. "Yes, and whatever he finds out will help us decide our next steps. Does that sound like a plan, Mike?" "Absolutely," Mike agreed, Mama Ada already moving towards the door. "It's certainly better than sitting here doing nothing." As Mama Ada made her way to Elder Chidi's house, she couldn't help but notice the villagers' reactions. Whispers and pointed fingers followed them, the air thick with gossip and speculation. "Did you hear?" one woman hissed to her neighbor. "The palace guards took Mr. James away. They carried him off like a sack of yams." Another man chimed in, his voice laced with judgment. "He must have done something terrible. Maybe he stole from the king himself." Mama Ada's shoulders tensed at the cruel words, but she pressed on, thoughts going through her mind. They don't know anything. As she approached Elder Chidi's compound, Mama Ada took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. She knocked on the door, her hand trembling slightly. Elder Chidi opened the door, a warm smile on his face that quickly faded as he took in Mama Ada's distressed expression. "Mama Ada," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Please come in. What troubles you?" She entered the modest home, the scent of herbs and burning incense filling the air. Elder Chidi gestured for her to sit on woven mats spread across the floor. "Elder Chidi," Mama Ada began, her voice quavering, "something terrible has happened. The palace guards came and took my husband away yesterday. We haven't heard anything since." Elder Chidi's eyes widened in shock. Taken away? But why? What could James have done to warrant such action? Mama Ada continued, her voice filled with worry. "We're not sure, Elder, but we think it might have something to do with a visitor we had recently. A Yoruba man." "A Yoruba man," Elder Chidi repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Here, in our community, without the king's knowledge." Mama Ada nodded solemnly. "It was Kiki's father, Mr. Akin. He came to speak with us about Mike and Kiki's relationship. We didn't think. We never imagined it could lead to this." Elder Chidi stroked his beard thoughtfully, his brow furrowed with concern. "This is indeed a serious matter. The king does not take kindly to unauthorized visitors from the Yoruba kingdom." Elder Chidi, Mama Ada pleaded, "I came to ask for your help. Could you please go to the palace and find out what's happening to my husband? We're desperate for any information." The old man's face grew grave. "Mama Ada, Mike, I want to help you, truly I do. But you must understand, I'm not a member of the king's cabinet. I don't have direct access to the palace or the king's ear." seeing the hope drain from her face, Elder Chidi quickly added, "However, I can't promise anything, but I will do my best to find out what's going on with James." Mama Ada's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Elder Chidi. Any help you can offer means the world to us." Elder Chidi nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Of course, my children. We are all one community here. Your troubles are our troubles." As Mama Ada stood to leave, Elder Chidi placed a comforting hand on her shoulders. "Try not to worry too much," he said softly. "I know it's difficult, but you must have faith. James is a good man, and surely the king will see that." Mama Ada nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Elder Chidi. Your words bring us comfort in these dark times." As they walked back home, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she thought to herself, "Can Elder Chidi be able to help?" Mama Ada sighed, her voice tinged with both hope and worry. "But I must trust in his wisdom and connections. For now, that's all I can do." She walked in silence. As she reached their hut, the weight of uncertainty still hung heavy on their shoulders, but a small spark of hope had been kindled in their hearts. With Elder Chidi's help, perhaps they would soon learn the truth about Mr. James's fate and find a way to bring him home. In the depths of the Ijibo Palace dungeon, Mr. James sat slumped against the cold stone wall, his eyes fixed on a sliver of sunlight streaming through a tiny window. The once proud man now looked haggard and defeated, his clothes dirty and his spirit broken. A plate of untouched food lay on the floor beside him, a testament to his despair. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Mr. James sprang to his feet, rushing to the cell door. "Guard! Guard!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Please let me out of this wretched hole." But the guard passed by without a word, leaving Mr. James to sink back to the floor, tears streaming down his face. "My family," he whispered. "What will become of them?" Above, in the grand throne room, King George sat upon his ornate wooden chair, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The weight of the situation with the Yoruba kingdom pressed heavily upon him. "You there?" he barked at a nearby guard. "Go to Elder Sylvester's house and summon him immediately." As the guard hurried off, King George turned to another. "Bring the prisoner, Mr. James, to me at once." While waiting, the king paced the room, his royal robes swishing with each step. He had always relied on Elder Sylvester's cunning advice, their shared duplicitous nature creating a strong bond between them. Soon, the dungeon guards dragged in Mr. James, who blinked in the bright light of the throne room. King George glared at the disheveled man. "Explain yourself," he demanded. Mr. James stepped forward, his voice trembling. "My lord, I don't understand. What am I to explain?" The king's patience wore thin. "Why did you allow a Yoruba man into our territory?" he growled. "Don't you know it's treason?" Realization dawned on Mr. James's face. "My lord, please," he pleaded, dropping to his knees. "I'm new to this community. I didn't know it was forbidden. It won't happen again, I swear." "You haven't answered my question," King George pressed. "What did he want?" Mr. James looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "It was about love, my lord. Mr. Akin came to ask forgiveness for his daughter. She and my son, they're in love." A sly smile crept across King George's face. "Love, you say? How? Interesting." At that moment, Elder Sylvester burst into the room, bowing low before the king. "You summoned me, my lord." "Ah." "Elder Sylvester," King George said, gesturing for him to sit. "Listen to what our friend Mr. James has to say." Mr. James repeated his story, his voice growing more desperate with each word. Elder Sylvester's eyes narrowed as he listened, a cruel glint in them. "Is that so?" the elder sneered, pointing his wooden staff at Mr. James. "You allowed an enemy into our midst for the sake of young love. You fool, you'll pay dearly for this transgression." King George nodded in agreement. "Guards, take him back to his cell while Elder Sylvester and I discuss his punishment." As the guards dragged Mr. James away, his pleas echoed through the halls. "Please, have mercy. Think of my family." Once alone, King George turned to Elder Sylvester. "What do you make of this, old friend?" "Oh, he must be punished," Elder Sylvester said dismissively. "Perhaps a public flogging to serve as a warning to others who might consider consorting with our enemies." "Nah, that's too generous. I want something much more severe and painful," King George said. As they continued to plot, neither man gave a thought to the suffering they were causing or the lives they were toying with. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Mr. James huddled in his cell, his mind racing. He thought of his wife and son, of young Kiki and her father. How had his simple act of kindness led to this? He closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer for their safety and for a miracle that might set things right. The bustling marketplace of the Yoruba village was suddenly disrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. A woman, her face etched with worry, ran through the crowded streets, her eyes fixed on a small shop ahead. As she approached, the shopkeeper, Mama Kiki, looked up from arranging her wares. "A Duke," Mama Kiki called out, recognizing her neighbor. "What's wrong? Why are you running like this?" A Duke skidded to a stop in front of the shop, bent over and gasping for breath. "Mama Kiki," she panted, her voice urgent. It's your husband." Mama Kiki's brow furrowed with concern. "My husband? What about him? Catch your breath and tell me properly." A Duke straightened up, her eyes wide with worry. "I saw the royal palace guards. They were taking him away from your compound." Mama Kiki's face drained of color. "What did you say?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe her ears. "The palace guards took my husband. Are you sure?" A Duke nodded vigorously. "Yes, I'm certain. I saw it with my own eyes." Inside the shop, Kiki had been arranging some fabrics when she overheard the commotion. Seeing her mother's distressed expression, she quickly made her way outside. Mama Kiki asked, her voice tinged with worry, "What's happening? Is everything all right?" Mama Kiki turned to her daughter, her face a mask of shock and fear. "Kiki, we need to go home right now. Your father, he's been taken by the palace guards." Kiki's eyes widened in disbelief. "Papa? But why? What could he have done?" Mama Kiki shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, my dear, but we need to find out." She turned to her daughter, her voice firm despite her fear. "Quickly, lock up the shop. We're going home immediately." As Kiki hurried to secure the shop, Mama Kiki turned to a Duke. "Thank you for telling us, a Duke. Did you see which way they took him?" A Duke pointed towards the palace. "They were heading in that direction." "Oh, Mama Kiki, I hope it's nothing serious." Mama Kiki nodded grimly. "So do I, a Duke. So do I." As soon as Kiki returned, they set off towards their home, their steps quick and purposeful. The usual chatter of the marketplace faded into the background as they hurried through the streets, their minds filled with worry. Mama Kiki said as they walked, her voice trembling slightly, "What do you think this is about? Papa hasn't done anything wrong, has he?" Mama Kiki squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly, even as her own heart raced with fear. "I'm sure your father hasn't done anything wrong, Kiki. There must be some misunderstanding." But deep down, a nagging thought tugged at Mama Kiki's mind. Could this have something to do with her husband's recent trip to the Igbo community? She had worried about that visit, knowing the tension between their peoples. But surely, a simple visit couldn't warrant this kind of response. Could it? As they approached their compound, they saw a small crowd of neighbors gathered, whispering among themselves. The sight only increased their anxiety. Mama Kiki, one of the neighbors, called out, "Is it true? Did the palace guards really take your husband?" Mama Kiki held her head high despite her fear. "That's what we've heard. We're going to find out what's happening." As they entered their home, the silence that greeted them was deafening. Mr. Akin's absence was palpable, leaving a void that filled both Mama Kiki and Kiki with dread. "What do we do now?" Mama Kiki asked, her voice small and frightened. Mama Kiki took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Now, my dear, we wait, and we pray. Your father is a good man. Whatever this is about, I'm sure it will be resolved soon." "Or perhaps we should go to the palace," Kiki added. "No, my dear, that's a bad idea. We cannot go into the palace without being summoned by the king. It will be a sign of disrespect and disregard." But as she spoke the words, Mama Kiki couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change dramatically. As the sun began to set outside their window, casting long shadows across the room, mother and daughter sat close together, drawing comfort from each other's presence and waiting for news that would determine their family's fate. As the palace gates swung open, Mr. Akin felt a mix of anxiety and confusion wash over him. The guards led him through the ornate corridors, their faces stern and unreadable. Despite his apprehension, Mr. Akin held his head high, knowing his reputation as a respected community member and successful farmer might work in his favor. Upon entering the throne room, Mr. Akin immediately noticed King Oba seated on his elaborate throne, deep in conversation with one of his cabinet members. The moment the king's eyes fell upon Mr. Akin, his demeanor shifted dramatically. The warm, jovial expression he had worn moments before vanished, replaced by a mask of stern displeasure. To Mr. Akin's surprise, however, King Oba's voice remained calm as he addressed him. "Ah, Mr. Akin, please have a seat." He gestured to a nearby chair, then dismissed the guards with a wave of his hand. The cabinet member, an elderly man with graying hair and kind eyes, nodded respectfully to Mr. Akin. "Good day, Mr. Akin. I hope this summons hasn't caused you too much distress." Mr. Akin settled into the offered chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The tension in the room was palpable, like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. Taking a deep breath, he decided to speak first. "My lord," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "may I ask what seems to be the matter? I must admit, I'm quite confused by this sudden summons." King Oba leaned forward, his eyes boring into Mr. Akin's. Despite the severity of the situation, there was a hint of respect in the king's gaze. After all, Mr. Akin's agricultural endeavors had greatly benefited the community, providing food and employment for many. "Well, Mr. Akin," King Oba began, his voice measured, "it has come to my attention that you recently paid a visit to the Igbo community. Is this correct?" Mr. Akin nodded solemnly, his suspicions confirmed. Before the king could continue, he quickly spoke up. "My lord, I must confess that I know I have committed a grave offense. I beg your forgiveness. My actions were driven solely by love for my family. I never imagined it would escalate to this point, warranting a summons to your palace. It was merely a brief visit, nothing more." King Oba exchanged a glance with his cabinet member, then turned back to Mr. Akin. "While your intentions may have been pure, Mr. Akin, you must understand the gravity of your actions. It is strictly forbidden to enter the Igbo community without formal approval. Now, the Igbo king is furious and has demanded that I punish you accordingly, if I fail to do so. He threatens war between our communities." The cabinet member shook his head sadly. "If only you had informed us beforehand, Mr. Akin. All of this could have been avoided." Mr. Akin's face fell, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. He looked from the king to the cabinet member, his voice tinged with desperation. "What can I do to make this right, my lord? Surely there must be some way to resolve this peacefully." King Oba leaned back in his throne, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "That, Mr. Akin, is the question we must answer. The peace between our kingdoms hangs in the balance." A heavy silence fell over the room as they all contemplated the gravity of the situation. Mr. Akin's mind raced, thinking of his daughter Kiki, of Mike and his family in the Igbo community. How could a simple act of love have led to such dire consequences? As the sun began to set over the Igbo community, Elder Chidi made his way towards the royal palace, his mind heavy with worry. The weight of Mama Ada's plea pressed upon him, urging him forward despite his own misgivings. "What if the king is angry with me for attending that meeting in the first place?" he muttered to himself, adjusting his red cap nervously. No, it was on neutral ground. Surely that won't be held against me." As he approached the palace gates, Elder Chidi took a deep breath, steeling himself for the encounter ahead. A guard stepped forward, eyeing the elder's red cap with respect. "Good evening, Elder," the guard said, bowing slightly. "What brings you to the palace at this hour?" Elder Chidi straightened his shoulders. "I'm here to speak with the king about a matter of great importance," he replied, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. The guard nodded. "Please wait here, Elder. I'll need to inform His Majesty of your arrival." As the guard disappeared into the palace, Elder Chidi found himself alone with his thoughts once more. The fate of Mr. James, and by extension his entire family, rested on this conversation. After what seemed like an eternity, the guard returned. "The king will see you now, Elder. Please follow me." Elder Chidi entered the grand throne room, immediately spotting King George seated on his ornate throne, with Elder Sylvester by his side. The air was thick with tension. "My lord," Elder Chidi said, bowing low and removing his cap in a show of respect. "Thank you for granting me an audience." King George's eyes narrowed slightly. "What brings you here, Elder Chidi? Speak quickly, for my patience wears thin." Elder Chidi took a deep breath. "My lord, I come on behalf of Mr. James. He is a close family friend, and his family is distraught, not knowing why he's been taken." King George's face darkened. "He brought a Yoruba man into our community. Such an act is unforgivable." Elder Chidi's heart raced, but he pressed on. "My lord, if I may explain. Mr. James was unaware of our community's rules. He's new here, and Mr. Akin's visit came as a complete surprise to him as well." Before King George could respond, Elder Sylvester interjected, his voice dripping with suspicion. "If he's such a close family friend of yours, Elder Chidi, why didn't you educate him about our rules? After all, you are a Red Chief Elder." King George nodded slowly. "That's a valid point, Elder Sylvester." Elder Chidi felt sweat beading on his forehead. "My lord, I understand how this looks. But I assure you, Mr. James was just as shocked to see Mr. Akin in his compound. He never intended any disrespect or harm to our community." King George leaned back in his throne, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity to Elder Chidi. Finally, the king spoke. "I will consider your words, Elder Chidi. Go now, and I will think on this matter of Mr. James." Relief washed over Elder Chidi, but he knew the battle was far from won. "Thank you, my lord. Your wisdom and mercy are greatly appreciated." As Elder Chidi turned to leave, he caught sight of Elder Sylvester leaning in close to King George, his eyes glinting with malice. My king, Elder Sylvester whispered, loud enough for Elder Chidi to hear. I hope you're not falling for this rubbish. Mr. James must pay for his treason. He must be punished severely. Elder Chidi's heart sank as he left the palace. He had done what he could, but would it be enough? As he made his way back to Mama Ada's house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Meanwhile, in the dungeon below, Mr. James sat in his cell, unaware of the forces moving above him. His thoughts were with his family, wondering if they were safe, if they knew what had happened to him.
Write the word continue in the comment section if you want the next part, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Kindly click the subscribe button, like, comment, and share this video. Watch out for more intriguing and eye-catching videos from your favorite YouTube channel.